Maskirovka, the Russian art of military deception, has been a pillar of Russian and Soviet military doctrine for over a century. Fake formations, false radio traffic, decoy equipment, deceptive troop movements. The Russians wrote the book on making an enemy see what you want them to see and believe what you want them to believe. For decades, Western military academies studied Soviet Maskirovka as one of the most sophisticated deception doctrines in the world. Now Ukraine is using it against them, and the student has surpassed the master. Just days ago, Ukrainian forces executed one of the most elaborate and successful deception operations of the entire war, a large-scale Maskirovka that created an entirely fictitious offensive on one section of the Eastern Front, drew Russia's operational reserves 30 kilometers out of position, and then struck the sector those reserves had just abandoned with a real attack that captured 3 positions, destroyed a command post, eliminated an ammunition depot, and inflicted over 200 casualties on the undermanned Russian defenders. When the Russian reserves arrived at the supposed crisis point and found nothing, no Ukrainian tanks, no assault forces, no offensive, they turned around and raced back south, only to be caught on the road by Ukrainian FPV drone teams that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The total operation, fake offensive, real offensive, and reserve ambush combined, cost Russia an estimated $50 to $75 million, and demonstrated that in this war, the army that thinks faster wins, regardless of numbers. This is how Ukraine turned Russia's own doctrine into Russia's worst nightmare. The deception was planned over 3 weeks by a joint team of Ukrainian intelligence, operations, and electronic warfare officers. The concept was elegant in its simplicity: create a threat large enough to force the Russian divisional commander to commit his operational reserve to a specific sector, then exploit the absence of that reserve in the sector it had been protecting. The plan required 2 things: a convincing fake offensive and a ready-to-execute real one. Both had to be timed with split-second precision. The fake had to draw the reserves before the real attack launched, and the real attack had to commence before the reserves could reverse course. The fake offensive was constructed in the northern section of the front, an area that Ukrainian intelligence assessed as the Russian commander's greatest vulnerability. This sector had been the focus of genuine Ukrainian probing attacks in preceding weeks, and the Russian command was already nervous about a potential breakthrough. Ukrainian planners intended to exploit that anxiety, to amplify an existing fear rather than create one from scratch. The deception operation began 5 days before the real attack. The first layer was electronic. Ukrainian signals intelligence teams began broadcasting fabricated radio traffic on frequencies that they knew Russian electronic intelligence was monitoring. The traffic mimicked the communications patterns of a Ukrainian assault brigade preparing for a major operation. Coordination orders between battalion commanders, logistics requests for ammunition and fuel, artillery registration fire, and engineering discussions about breach plans for Russian minefields. The traffic was carefully scripted, written by intelligence officers who understood both Ukrainian and Russian communications doctrine, who knew what a Russian analyst listening to Ukrainian radio would expect to hear in the days before an assault, and who embedded just enough real-sounding detail to make the intercepts convincing. The second layer was physical. Ukrainian forces deployed inflatable decoy vehicles in positions visible to Russian reconnaissance drones, replicas of tanks, BMPs, and artillery pieces that from the air are nearly indistinguishable from real equipment. The decoys were positioned in assembly areas and staging positions consistent with a brigade preparing to attack, clustered near roads oriented toward the Russian lines, with vehicle tracks in the march mud leading to and from the positions to simulate recent movement. At night, small heat sources were placed near the decoys to create thermal signatures that Russian drones' infrared cameras would interpret as running engines. The third layer was demonstrative action. Ukrainian forces conducted a series of aggressive reconnaissance probes against Russian positions in the northern sector. Small unit actions involving 5 to 10 soldiers probing the Russian defensive line, testing reactions, drawing fire, and then withdrawing. These probes were real soldiers taking real risks, but their purpose was deception rather than reconnaissance. Each probe was designed to reinforce the Russian assessment that Ukraine was preparing for a major assault by testing the defenses in advance. The fourth layer was artillery. On the morning of the real attack, In the south, Ukrainian artillery in the northern sector fired a simulated preparatory bombardment. 150 shells struck the open ground in front of the Russian positions, falling in the pattern of a suppression barrage that typically precedes a ground assault. The shells hit empty terrain, the same technique that the Russian general had used in another scenario, but this time employed deliberately as deception. The bombardment was loud, visible, and exactly what a Russian observer would expect to see 15 minutes before a Ukrainian assault wave crossed the line. Stay with this. Every element of the deception was designed to trigger a specific response from the Russian command. And that response came exactly as Ukrainian planners had predicted. The Russian divisional commander, receiving a convergence of intelligence indicators, intercepted Ukrainian communications discussing assault preparations, drone imagery showing armored vehicles massing in assembly areas, aggressive reconnaissance probes against his northern positions, and now an artillery bombardment consistent with an imminent ground assault, made the decision the Ukrainian planners had been engineering for 5 days. He ordered his operational reserve, a reinforced battalion of approximately 400 soldiers with 15 armored vehicles, to move immediately from its position in the central sector to the northern sector to reinforce the positions he believed were about to be attacked. The reserve began moving at approximately 0600 hours, the same moment the artillery bombardment in the north reached its peak. The column of vehicles, BMPs, tanks, trucks, departed its staging area and headed north along a road that Ukrainian surveillance drones were already tracking. The moment Ukrainian intelligence confirmed the reserve was en route, at approximately 0620, when the column was observed 7 kilometers into its movement, the signal was sent south. The real attack began. Which element of the deception was most important? A. The fake radio traffic. B. The inflatable vehicles. C. The demonstrative probes. D. The simulated artillery bombardment. Or was it the combination? Tell us in the comments. 30 kilometers to the south, in the sector the reserve battalion had just abandoned, 3 Ukrainian assault groups launched simultaneously against Russian positions that were now undermanned, undersupported, and without the rapid reaction reinforcement that had been their safety net. The southern sector had been held by approximately 250 Russian soldiers in a network of fortified positions, a strength level that was already marginal but had been considered adequate because the reserve battalion, just 20 minutes away, could respond to any Ukrainian attack. With the reserve gone, racing north to fight inflatable tanks, the 250 defenders were on their own. The first assault group, approximately 50 Ukrainian soldiers, struck a fortified strongpoint on the western edge of the sector. The position was held by 40 Russian soldiers who had been expecting a quiet morning. Instead, they received a 4-minute artillery preparation, followed by Ukrainian infantry pouring through their wire from 2 directions. The strongpoint fell in under an hour. 28 Russian soldiers were killed, 12 captured. The Ukrainian assault team suffered 3 wounded. The second assault group, approximately 40 soldiers supported by an FPV drone team, attacked a Russian company position in the center of the sector. This position was more heavily fortified, but the garrison was under strength, only about 50 soldiers, many of them exhausted from weeks of frontline rotation that the reserve's departure had made impossible to complete. The assault was supported by precision artillery and a swarm of FPV drones that systematically destroyed the position's machine gun nests and observation posts before the infantry closed. The position fell in 90 minutes. 35 Russian soldiers killed, 18 captured, the remainder scattered. The third assault was not a ground attack, but a precision strike. Ukrainian HIMARS delivered 4 rockets onto the Russian battalion command post that controlled the southern sector, a target that had been under surveillance for weeks but had been held in reserve for exactly this moment. The command post, located in a basement beneath a damaged building, was destroyed. The battalion commander, his operations officer, and an estimated 6 staff members were confirmed killed through intercepted communications. The battalion's communications hub was eliminated, severing contact between the headquarters and the remaining positions in the sector. Simultaneously, Ukrainian artillery struck an ammunition depot that had been identified through drone surveillance, a concealed storage point in a farm building approximately 5 kilometers behind the Russian positions. The strike triggered secondary explosions that continued for over 3 hours, consuming the stored munitions in a chain reaction visible from kilometers away. By 0800, 2 hours after the real attack began, the southern sector was in ruins. 3 positions captured, a command post destroyed, an ammunition depot burning, over 200 Russian casualties, killed, wounded, and captured. And the reserve battalion that could have responded was 30 kilometers away. Arriving at a northern sector where the threatening Ukrainian offensive consisted of inflatable rubber tanks and recorded radio chatter. How much do you think an inflatable decoy tank costs compared to the real equipment Russia lost because of the deception? A. $500, B. $2,000, C. $5,000. Even at the highest estimate, the cost ratio is absurd. Drop your answer below. The Russian Reserve Battalion arrived in the northern sector at approximately 0745. They found the positions they had been sent to reinforce intact. No Ukrainian assault was in progress. No Ukrainian forces were crossing the line. The artillery bombardment had stopped. The aggressive probes had ceased. The commanding officer of the Reserve Battalion, confused, reported to the divisional headquarters that there was no attack in the north. The soldiers of the Reserve Battalion dismounted from their vehicles and looked at the positions they had been sent to save. The Russian defenders in the northern sector, who had spent the morning crouching in their trenches expecting a massive Ukrainian assault, emerged cautiously and confirmed what the reserve commander was seeing. Nothing. The inflatable decoys, visible from the air as convincing tank shapes, were harder to detect from ground level at distance. But a few soldiers with binoculars noticed that the tanks in the Ukrainian assembly areas were not moving, had no exhaust signatures, and appeared to sway slightly in the morning wind. The realization that they had been duped, that 400 soldiers and 15 armored vehicles had driven 30 kilometers at full speed to defend against rubber decoys, spread through the ranks with a mixture of disbelief and fury. But the fury was misdirected. The reserve soldiers were angry at the Ukrainian deception. They should have been angry at the intelligence staff that failed to verify the threat before committing the division's only reserve. They should have been angry at a command system so slow, so rigid, and so prone to panic that it could be manipulated by inflatable tanks and pre-recorded radio messages. Because while they stood in the northern sector feeling foolish, 300 of their comrades in the south were dying. At approximately 0800, the divisional commander received simultaneous reports. The northern sector was quiet and the southern sector was collapsing. The realization struck like a physical blow. Intercepted communications captured a moment of stunned silence on the division's command network, before the commander ordered the reserve to reverse course immediately and move south. The reserve battalion turned around. 400 soldiers and 15 vehicles that had just driven 30 kilometers north now began driving 30 kilometers south, exhausted, confused, and moving along roads that Ukrainian forces had been watching since dawn. The drone ambush was waiting. Ukrainian FPV drone teams, pre-positioned along the road that the reserve would have to take on its return journey, launched the moment the column was confirmed moving south. The operators had specific target priorities: the lead vehicles to slow the column, command vehicles to disrupt coordination, and fuel trucks to create road-blocking fires. The first drone hit a BMP at the head of the column at approximately 0820. The vehicle was disabled, forcing the column to detour around it on the muddy road shoulder. A second drone struck a command vehicle, a BTR with antenna arrays, killing or wounding the staff officers inside. A third drone hit a fuel truck, creating a fire that blocked the road for 15 minutes, while soldiers scrambled to find a bypass through the March mud. Over the following 2 hours, as the reserve column struggled south through a gauntlet of drone strikes, Ukrainian FPV teams hit a total of 6 vehicles, 3 BMPs disabled or destroyed, 1 fuel truck burned, 1 command vehicle eliminated, and 1 supply truck knocked out. An estimated 30 to 40 Russian soldiers were killed or wounded during the movement. The column's speed dropped to a crawl, soldiers dismounting and walking alongside the vehicles, watching the sky for drones, stopping at every sound. The reserve arrived in the southern sector at approximately 1100 hours, over 5 hours after the real attack had begun. By then, every Ukrainian objective had been achieved. The 3 positions were captured and being fortified by Ukrainian troops. The command post and ammunition depot were destroyed. The Ukrainian assault forces had consolidated their gains and established new defensive lines. The 400 soldiers of the reserve battalion arrived too late to effect anything, and arrived having lost 6 vehicles and 30 to 40 men to drone attacks that they could not prevent, could not predict, and could not counter. Is Russia's inability to detect Ukrainian deception operations a failure of intelligence, a failure of imagination, or proof that Ukraine is simply outthinking them? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Now, the total economics of a deception that cost Ukraine almost nothing and cost Russia almost everything. Cost of the Ukrainian deception operation: inflatable decoys, scripted radio broadcasts, demonstrative probes, and simulated artillery bombardment. Estimated $300,000 to $500,000. The inflatable vehicles, perhaps 30 to 40 units, cost approximately $2,000 to $5,000 each. The radio deception required personnel, time, and equipment already in use. The artillery bombardment used approximately 150 shells, worth roughly $150,000 to $200,000. Cost of the real offensive: 3 assault groups, HIMARS strikes on the command post and ammunition depot, FPV drone ambush of the returning reserve, 3 assault operations, ammunition, casualties, and support. Estimated $1 to $2 million. HIMARS rockets for command post and depot strikes, approximately $500,000 to $1 million. FPV drone operations against the reserve column, approximately $30,000 to $50,000. Artillery and surveillance drone support, approximately $500,000 to $1 million. Total Ukrainian expenditure, approximately $2.5 to $4.5 million. Russian losses: southern sector, 3 positions lost with garrisons, approximately 140 Russian soldiers killed or wounded, 50 captured. Personnel losses: $5 to $8 million. Fortified positions and equipment: $4 to $7 million. Command post destroyed with staff: $3 to $5 million. Ammunition depot destroyed: $5 to $10 million. Reserve column drone ambush: 6 vehicles destroyed, 30 to 40 casualties, $3 to $6 million. Reserve movement costs: fuel consumed in 60 kilometers of fruitless driving, vehicle wear, lost time and operational disruption, approximately $500,000 to $1 million. Cascading operational costs: southern sector command vacuum, supply disruption from depot destruction, positions lost requiring reconstitution, estimated $10 to $20 million. Total estimated Russian losses: $31 to $57 million. $4.5 million Ukrainian dollars to inflict $57 million in Russian damage, with the added strategic humiliation of having been defeated by rubber tanks and scripted radio chatter. A cost-exchange ratio of approximately 13 to 1. If facts like these prove that Ukraine is winning the intelligence war on every level, type truth in the comments. What should Ukraine's next deception operation target? Tell us below. The deception operation's greatest legacy is not the positions captured or the equipment destroyed. It is the doubt it has planted in every Russian commander's mind. The next time Ukrainian forces appear to be massing for an attack, the next time intercepted radio traffic suggests an offensive is imminent, the next time drone imagery shows tanks in assembly areas, is it real, or is it another fake designed to pull reserves out of position? That doubt is a weapon more powerful than any missile. It slows Russian decision-making, it makes commanders hesitate, it forces them to hold reserves in place rather than committing them, which means those reserves are unavailable when they are genuinely needed. And it creates an information environment where Russian intelligence can never be fully certain whether what it is seeing is real or manufactured. Ukraine has turned Maskirovka, Russia's own doctrine, against its creators. And as this operation proved, the student has learned the lesson well enough to teach the master a thing or two about deception. The historical irony is profound. Soviet military doctrine pioneered the use of inflatable decoys, false radio traffic, and demonstration attacks. Soviet planners used Maskirovka to devastating effect in World War II. The deception operations before the Battle of Kursk and Operation Bagration are studied in military academies worldwide. For decades, the Russian military celebrated this heritage as proof of Russian strategic genius. Now that genius belongs to Ukraine. Ukrainian officers, many of them trained in the same Soviet legacy military academies, where Maskirovka was taught, have taken the doctrine, modernized it with 21st century technology, and applied it against the very army that invented it. The inflatable tanks are better than their Soviet predecessors. The false radio traffic is scripted with knowledge of how Russian signals intelligence processes intercepts. The demonstrative probes are designed to trigger specific responses in the Russian command cycle. Everything about this deception operation was tailored to exploit Russian doctrine, Russian habits, and Russian psychology, because the Ukrainians who planned it understand those things better than the Russians who fall for them. 3 questions before you go. First, if Ukrainian inflatable tanks and scripted radio traffic can convince a Russian divisional commander to move his entire reserve 30 kilometers out of position, what does this say about Russian intelligence capability, and how many previous Ukrainian operations have included deception elements that Russia never detected? Second, the Russian reserve battalion spent 5 hours driving 60 kilometers north and then south, arriving too late to effect either battle. If Ukrainian deception can render Russian reserves useless simply by making them drive in circles, does Russia effectively have no reserve capability against a thinking enemy? Third, every element of this deception, the inflatable decoys, the radio scripts, the demonstrative probes, cost a fraction of the damage they caused. As Ukraine refines and scales these techniques, how many future Russian operations will be disrupted by threats that exist only in the imagination of Russian commanders? Think about that. Subscribe to Steel Command. Share this video. Ukraine built an army out of rubber and radio waves, and Russia sent 400 soldiers to fight it. While those soldiers drove north to fight nothing, Ukrainian warriors struck south and took everything. The fake front cost pennies. The real front cost Russia millions. And somewhere on the Eastern Front right now, another set of inflatable tanks is being positioned. And another Russian commander is about to make the worst decision of his career.